Researchers took a group of people and told each of them something about their future that was not true. They fabricated it. In some studies, they told people they possessed a trait they had never demonstrated. In others, they informed people that a test had revealed something about their future capabilities, when in fact the test had revealed nothing and the information was assigned at random. The people were given a false future, a fiction, an expectation about who they were going to become, manufactured in a lab and handed to them as fact. And then the researchers stepped back and watched. And in study after study, across decades of this kind of research, the same startling thing happened. The false future started coming true. The people began, measurably, becoming the thing they had been falsely told they were. Their behavior changed. Their performance changed. Their results changed. The fiction reached forward and reorganized reality to match itself. In this video, I'm going to walk you through this body of research, show you the exact mechanism by which a false expectation converts itself into a true outcome, and then show you the thing that should stop you cold, which is that this mechanism is running in your life right now, converting the expectations you hold about your own future into your actual future, whether those expectations are true, false, or simply assumed. The scientists proved that a fabricated future can become real. The question this video will leave you with is which future you've been fabricating for yourself. Let me start with the most famous version of this research because it established the phenomenon so clearly that it changed how an entire field understood human potential. In the 1960s, a psychologist named Robert Rosenthal ran an experiment in an elementary school that has become one of the most cited studies in the history of psychology. He gave all the students a standard test at the beginning of the year. Then he told the teachers that the test had identified certain specific children as intellectual bloomers, students who were about to enter a period of dramatic intellectual growth and would significantly outperform their peers over the coming year. The teachers received the names of these special students and went about their year. But here is what the teachers did not know. The test had identified nothing. The children labeled as intellectual bloomers had not scored differently from anyone else. They had been selected completely at random. There was no real difference between the bloomers and the rest of the class. The only difference that existed anywhere was in the teachers' minds, an expectation, a false future that had been planted in them about which children were destined to excel. At the end of the year, Rosenthal tested all the children again, and the children who had been randomly labeled as bloomers had, in fact, bloomed. They showed significantly greater gains in measured intelligence than their peers. The false future had come true. Children selected at random with no actual advantage of any kind had become high performers purely because an expectation had been planted about them. The fiction had manufactured the fact. And the effect was strongest among the youngest children, the ones most open, most receptive, most susceptible to the expectations held about them. Rosenthal spent years working out the mechanism, and it came down to the subtle, mostly unconscious ways the teachers' expectations changed their behavior toward the bloomers. It operated through 4 channels. First, climate. Teachers created a warmer emotional climate around the children they expected to excel. More attention, more warmth, more encouragement, communicated largely through tone, posture, and micro-expression rather than explicit words. Second, input. They taught these children more and more challenging material because they expected them to be able to handle it. Third, response opportunity. They called on these children more, gave them more chances to respond, waited longer for their answers. And fourth, feedback. They gave these children more and better feedback, more nuanced, more encouraging, more focused on growth. 4 channels, all largely unconscious, all flowing automatically from the expectation. The teachers were not aware they were doing any of this. They believed they were treating all students equally, but their expectation had reorganized their behavior at a level below their awareness, and the reorganized behavior produced the reality the expectation predicted. I want to emphasize how small and unconscious these behaviors were, because that's the part that makes the finding both believable and unsettling. We're not talking about teachers openly favoring certain children. If you had asked them, they would have sincerely told you they treated everyone the same, and they would have believed it. The differences showed up in things no one consciously controls. A fraction of a second longer waiting for an answer before moving on, which communicates, I believe you can get this. A warmth in the eyes when a certain child spoke, a slightly more patient tone when explaining something difficult, a tendency to lean in rather than away, a reflex to interpret a bloomer's wrong answer as a near miss worth exploring and another child's identical wrong answer as simply wrong. Each of these micro-behaviors is almost too small to notice in isolation, but a child receives thousands of them over a school year, and thousands of tiny signals of belief accumulate into a powerful, sustained message about who that child is and what they're capable of. The child absorbs the message and becomes it. This is how an expectation held silently in an adult's mind reaches into a child and changes their measured intelligence. Not through anything dramatic, through 10,000 microsignals, each one flowing automatically and invisibly from the expectation, each one nudging the child toward the future the adult expected. Sit with what this means, because it is profound. The expectation did not change the children directly. It changed the behavior of the person holding the expectation, and the changed behavior changed the children. The false future became true through a cascade of subtle behavioral changes that flowed automatically and unconsciously from the expectation itself. The expectation was a self-fulfilling prophecy, not through wishing, but through the concrete behavioral consequences of holding it. This is the mechanism. And now watch what happens when we turn it from teachers and students toward you and your own future. Because here is the thing that transforms this from an interesting piece of psychology into something that should change how you live. You are both the teacher and the student. You hold expectations about your own future, and those expectations reorganize your own behavior toward yourself. Unconsciously, exactly the way the teacher's expectations reorganize their behavior toward the children. The false future you hold about yourself becomes true through the same 4 channels, turned inward. Consider the climate channel first. The teacher created a warmer emotional climate around the child they expected to succeed. Now, what emotional climate do you create around yourself based on the future you expect for yourself? If you hold an expectation of failure, of limitation, of things not working out for you, you create a cold, harsh, discouraging internal climate around yourself, exactly the kind of climate that produces poor performance in a child. And if you hold an expectation of success, of capability, of a future that works out, you create a warm, encouraging, supportive internal climate, the kind that produces flourishing. Your expectation about your future determines the emotional climate you live inside every day, and that climate shapes what you become exactly as it did for the children. Consider the input channel. The teacher gave more challenging material to the children they expected to excel. What challenges do you give yourself based on the future you expect? If you expect little of your future, you give yourself little, you avoid the challenging material, you don't attempt the difficult thing, because your expectation tells you it's beyond you. And if you expect much of your future, you give yourself more, you take on the harder task, you attempt the thing that stretches you, because your expectation tells you you can handle it. Your expectation determines the input you give yourself, and the input shapes your growth. Consider the response opportunity channel. The teacher gave more chances to the children they expected to succeed. How many chances do you give yourself, based on the future you expect? The person who expects failure gives themselves fewer attempts, quits sooner, stops trying after the first setback, because their expectation says the outcome is already determined. The person who expects success gives themselves more attempts, persists longer, keeps showing up because their expectation says the success is coming. Your expectation determines how many chances you give yourself, and the number of chances determines how many successes you have. And consider the feedback channel. The teacher gave better, more growth-focused feedback to the children they expected to excel. What feedback do you give yourself based on the future you expect? The person expecting failure gives themselves harsh, global, discouraging feedback. I'm bad at this, I always fail, this is just who I am. The person expecting success gives themselves nuanced, growth-focused, encouraging feedback. That didn't work. Let me adjust. I'm learning. Your expectation determines the quality of the feedback you give yourself, and the feedback shapes whether you improve or collapse. 4 channels, the exact same 4 channels Rosenthal identified in the teachers, except you are running all 4 of them on yourself, continuously, based on the future you expect for yourself. Which means the self-fulfilling prophecy that manufactured intelligence and randomly selected school children is running in your life right now, converting your expected future into your actual future through the concrete behavioral consequences of the expectations you hold about yourself. The false future becomes true. The only question is, which future you've been feeding yourself. I saw this operating in my own life so clearly. Once I understood the 4 channels, that it was almost uncomfortable to look at. For years, I had carried an expectation about my future in one particular domain, an expectation I'd never chosen and never examined, that I simply wasn't going to be one of the people who made it. And when I traced how that expectation had been shaping my behavior, all 4 channels were running in the wrong direction, exactly as the research predicted. My internal climate around that domain was cold and harsh, full of preemptive discouragement. My input was limited because I quietly avoided the challenging material, telling myself it wasn't worth the effort since it wasn't going to work out anyway. My chances were few because I gave up quickly whenever I hit resistance, reading each setback as confirmation of the future I expected. And my feedback to myself was brutal and global, treating every stumble as proof of a fixed inadequacy rather than a step in a learning process. I was, without any awareness of it, being the worst possible teacher to myself, the kind of teacher whose low expectations produce exactly the failure they predict. And the results I'd been getting, which I had always interpreted as evidence of my actual limits, were not evidence of my limits at all. They were the output of an expectation, manufactured through 4 channels I didn't know I was running. When I finally changed the expectation and, more importantly, started deliberately running the 4 channels in the right direction, the results changed. Not overnight, but steadily and unmistakably, in the direction of the new future I'd chosen. The limit had never been real. The expectation had been doing all the work the entire time. Let me deepen this with more of the research, because Rosenthal's classroom study is only one example of a phenomenon that shows up everywhere scientists have looked for it. The same effect has been demonstrated in the military, where randomly selected trainees who were labeled as having high potential and whose commanders were told to expect great things from them went on to significantly outperform their peers, purely because of the expectation their commanders held. It's been demonstrated in the workplace, where employees whose managers held high expectations of them performed measurably better than equally capable employees whose managers held low expectations. It's been demonstrated in athletics, in nursing homes, in courtrooms. Wherever one person holds a strong expectation about another person's future, that expectation tends to reorganize behavior in ways that make it come true. The phenomenon is so robust and so widely replicated that it has a name in psychology, the Pygmalion effect, after the myth of the sculptor whose statue came to life, and its dark twin has a name too, the golem effect, which is what happens when a negative expectation reorganizes behavior to produce failure. Both are real, both are documented. Expectations sculpt reality in both directions. And here's a dimension of this that reaches into your closest relationships, because it changes how you understand the people around you. If expectations sculpt reality, then the expectations the important people in your life hold about you have been shaping you, and the expectations you hold about them have been shaping them. The parent who expected a child to struggle and unconsciously ran the 4 negative channels may have manufactured the very struggle they feared. The partner who expects the worst of the other and treats them accordingly through 1,000 micro-signals of distrust may be sculpting the untrustworthiness they dread. And the reverse is just as true and far more hopeful. To hold a genuinely high expectation of someone you love, to expect their best and let that expectation warm your climate toward them, expand what you offer them, extend them more chances, and shape your feedback toward their growth is to actively sculpt them toward that best. This is not manipulation. It's the recognition that you are always sculpting the people close to you with your expectations, whether you intend to or not, and that you might as well sculpt deliberately and generously. The most loving thing you can do for another person may simply be to hold and keep holding a higher expectation of them than their circumstances currently justify, exactly as Rosenthal's teachers did for children who had done nothing to earn it, and watch what that expectation calls forth. People tend to become who the people around them expect them to be. Choose, then, to be someone in whose expectations the people you love can flourish. Now, there's an even more striking layer to this research, one that moves it from how others' expectations shape us to how our own expectations shape us directly. There's a large body of research on self-expectation, on placebo, on how the future a person expects for themselves reaches back and reorganizes their present physiology and behavior. We've covered some of this in other videos, the way the body responds to an expected reality as though it were already real. But I want to add one specific and remarkable line of it here, because it closes the loop. Studies on what psychologists call expectancy have shown that when people are led to expect they will perform well at a task, they actually do perform better, and when they're led to expect they'll perform poorly, they perform worse, even when the initial expectation was assigned to them arbitrarily and had no basis in their actual ability. The expectation, once installed, becomes a cause. It changes effort, persistence, attention, physiological arousal, and the interpretation of feedback, and all of these changes push actual performance in the direction of the expectation. The person told they'd do well tries harder, persists longer, stays calmer, interprets difficulty as a challenge rather than a threat, and performs better as a result. The expectation manufactured the outcome. And this happens with expectations we simply absorb about ourselves, whether or not they were ever true, whether or not anyone installed them deliberately, whether or not they have any basis in reality at all. The future you expect for yourself is not a passive prediction. It's an active cause, reaching backward from the imagined future into your present behavior and reorganizing that behavior to produce the future you expected. Write this down because it's the whole thing in a sentence. The future you expect is not a forecast. It's an instruction. Your expectation about who you're going to become is not sitting passively in your mind, waiting to be confirmed or disproven by events. It is actively organizing your climate, your input, your chances, and your feedback right now to produce itself. You are not predicting your future. You are, through the mechanism of expectation, manufacturing it. Now let me connect this to what the teachers of consciousness have always said, because the convergence is exact. Neville Goddard taught that your assumption about yourself, held and persisted in, hardens into fact. He said you become what you assume yourself to be. And the Pygmalion research is that teaching, demonstrated in classrooms, in barracks, in offices, under controlled conditions. Rosenthal's teachers held an assumption about the children, and the children became what was assumed. You hold an assumption about yourself, and you become what you assume. Neville arrived at it through spiritual practice. Rosenthal arrived at it through educational psychology, and they landed in the identical place. The expectation, the assumption, the imagined future is a creative force that reorganizes behavior and circumstance to match itself. What Neville called assumption, the psychologists call expectancy. What Neville called hardening into fact, the psychologists call the self-fulfilling prophecy. Same mechanism, two vocabularies, one reality. And this convergence should give you a great deal of confidence because it means the practice of deliberately assuming a desired future for yourself is not wishful thinking. It's the deliberate operation of a mechanism that mainstream science has documented for over half a century. When you assume a positive future for yourself and hold that assumption, you are doing to yourself exactly what Rosenthal's expectation did to the bloomers. You are installing an expectation that will reorganize your climate, your input, your chances, and your feedback in the direction of that future, and those reorganized behaviors will produce the future you assumed. The false future becomes true, except it doesn't have to be false. You get to choose which future to install, and a deliberately chosen positive future operates by the same mechanism as a randomly assigned one, except that you aimed it on purpose. Here's what makes this so urgent, and it's the thing I most want you to take from this video. The mechanism is not optional. It's running whether you engage it consciously or not. Right now, you hold some expectation about your future, and it is already reorganizing your behavior to produce itself. If you've absorbed a negative expectation about your future, from your upbringing, from past failures, from the messages you received about who you are and what's possible for you, then that negative expectation is running the golem effect on you right now, creating a cold internal climate, causing you to give yourself less challenging input, fewer chances, and harsher feedback, all of which are producing the very failure you expect. You are not failing because you're incapable. You may be failing because you've absorbed an expectation of failure, and that expectation is manufacturing the outcome exactly as it manufactured intelligence in the school children, just aimed in the opposite direction. And this is the liberation hidden in the research. If your current results are being shaped by an absorbed, unexamined, possibly completely false expectation about your future, then those results are not a verdict on your actual potential. They're the output of an expectation, and expectations can be changed. The children were not actually more intelligent. They were expected to be, and the expectation manufactured the intelligence. Which means that whatever your current expectation about yourself has been manufacturing, a different expectation would manufacture a different result. The randomly selected bloomer had no special gift. They had a special expectation, and a special expectation is available to anyone willing to install it and hold it. Let me put this as directly as I can, because it may be the single most important reframe in this entire video. You have almost certainly been reading your results as data about your potential. You look at what you've achieved, or failed to achieve, and you draw conclusions about what you're capable of. This is what everyone does, and it feels rigorous and honest. But the Rosenthal research reveals that this reasoning is backwards, because your results were never neutral data about your potential. They were the manufactured output of the expectation you were carrying. The unlucky child in the study, who wasn't labeled a bloomer, might have had every bit as much raw potential as the one who was, and would have produced worse results anyway, purely because a different expectation was manufacturing a different outcome. If that child had then looked at their results and concluded, "I'm just not that capable," they would have been drawing a false conclusion from data that had been rigged by expectation. And that is very likely what you have been doing. Your disappointing results in some area are not proof of your limits. They are proof of what your expectation has been manufacturing. Change the expectation, and you change the factory, and the factory starts producing something different. The results that felt like a life sentence turn out to have been a rented belief you can return. So how do you deliberately install a new expectation about your future? One that will reorganize your behavior to produce the future you actually want. Let me give you the practical work, drawn directly from the mechanism the research revealed. First, identify the future you're currently expecting, because most people have never examined it. Ask yourself honestly what you actually expect your future to hold, not what you hope for. What you expect at the gut level when you imagine the years ahead. For many people, this honest examination reveals a quietly negative expectation they've been carrying without ever choosing it, an absorbed sense that things won't fully work out, that they're limited, that people like them don't get the good outcome. That absorbed expectation has been running the 4 channels in the wrong direction, and identifying it is the first step to changing it. Second, deliberately construct the new expectation, the future you choose, rather than the one you absorbed. And here's the key. Informed by the research. It's not enough to hope for the new future. You have to genuinely expect it. Hold it as an assumption about what is going to happen, with the same settled certainty the teachers held about the bloomers. The teachers didn't hope the bloomers would excel. They expected it as fact, and that expectation is what reorganized their behavior. Your new future has to be held as expectation, not hope, because only expectation reorganizes behavior. Hope leaves the behavior unchanged. Expectation changes everything. Third, install the expectation at the level where it takes hold, which is the deep, receptive state rather than the surface conscious mind. Absorbed negative expectations were usually installed early, in suggestible states, and they're held below conscious awareness, which is why arguing with them consciously rarely works. The new expectation has to be installed at the same depth through repeated, felt, embodied assumption of the future you're choosing until it sinks below the surface and becomes your actual gut-level expectation rather than a conscious wish sitting on top of an unexamined negative one. And fourth, watch the 4 channels and let the new expectation reorganize them. As the new expectation takes hold, notice the internal climate warming. Notice yourself giving yourself more challenging input, more chances, better feedback. And where you catch the old expectation still running the channels in the wrong direction, the harsh internal climate, the self-imposed limits, the quitting early, the cruel feedback, gently redirect. You're not just installing a new belief. You're installing a new set of behaviors toward yourself, the exact behaviors that the teachers unconsciously directed at the children they expected to succeed. Become, toward yourself, the teacher who expects you to bloom. Let me bring this back to where we started, to a classroom full of children who were told, falsely, that they were about to become extraordinary, and who then became extraordinary because of it. There was nothing special about those children at the start. They were chosen by a random process. The only thing they had that their peers didn't was an expectation, held about them by someone whose behavior that expectation quietly reorganized. And that was enough. That was enough to change their measured intelligence, to change the trajectory of their year, to make a fabricated future real. You have been living inside expectations about your future your entire life, most of them absorbed rather than chosen, many of them possibly as false as the labels given to those children, and every one of them reorganizing your behavior to produce itself. The research proves that these expectations are not passive predictions. They are active causes. They manufacture the futures they describe, which means the most important thing you can do for your future is not to work harder within your current expectation, but to examine and deliberately change the expectation itself, because the expectation is upstream of the behavior, and the behavior is upstream of the results. Change the expected future, and you change the behavior that produces it, and you change the future that results. The scientists gave those children a false future, and it came true. You can give yourself a chosen one, and by the exact same mechanism, watch it do the same. The fabricated future became real for children who did nothing but absorb it. Imagine what a deliberately chosen future can do for someone who installs it on purpose, holds it as genuine expectation, and lets it reorganize their life from the inside out. That's not hope. That's the documented mechanism of how expectation becomes reality, turned for once in the direction you actually want to go.